citing the LA Times and David Ignatius and all of these reports that were coming out about the CIA and what Susan Rice was given talking points wise, and what you heard from Stephanie Cutter there.
Well, that was a full court spin. To respond to Cutter, she said anytime Americans die, it's a tragedy. Yes, but when Americans die in an embassy whose security people were begging for more support, for more security, the requests of which were ignored, were left in a hot zone where Al-Qaeda was rising, becoming more active. That's not a tragedy. That is a failure. It was a huge failure. The first time in 30 years an ambassador is killed, and a humiliation for the United States. That's number one. Now, the full court spin is so obvious, but it contradicts so many things. Let's just go back to the last debate. The president takes credit for calling this a terror attack on day one, and then for the next 2 weeks he denies that, or he says we don't know, or we're continuing to look into it, up until The View, when he's on 2 weeks later. Even by the timeline that the administration was leaking everywhere over the weekend as a way to give the impression it's all the fault of the CIA, even according to that timeline, on September 20th, the CIA concludes that there was no demonstration. It sends it up in a report to the White House 2 days later. 3 days later, the president shows up on The View, is asked, was this a terror attack? And he says, we're still investigating. And he says it wasn't just a mob action at a time where, according to their own timeline, they knew there was no mob, there was no demonstration, there was nothing outside. So the contradictions are all over the place, and there's no way even this weekend spin is able to take away the truth of that statement.
Chuck.
Well, I'm going to disagree respectfully but slightly with my friend Charles. Look, what I've learned out of the last 3 weeks trying to follow this issue and make sense of everything going back and forth is that we have a fundamentally ambiguous situation on the ground at the beginning of this event. It could be described as spontaneous and an act of terror. I don't know why those two things can't go together. And I'm thoroughly convinced at this point that the worst way to actually arrive at an objective story is to do it the way we're all doing it, namely in the heat of a political campaign. There were people on the ground talking to the press, members of this, whatever it was, gang, militia, mob, terrorist unit, claiming to Western journalists that they were there because of the video. Now, I don't know if that proves anything, but if I were an intelligence agency or I was the administration, I wouldn't exactly ignore that information. I wouldn't exactly treat it as if it didn't exist. I think we'll finally get to a lot closer to the truth of this matter after November 6th.
Yeah, after November 6th, Steve.
Well, I think that's true, but what I think we've seen is we had an administration come out early and sell a storyline. It wasn't as if they just waited and said, we can't possibly provide this information because we don't have it all, there's too much ambiguity, this is fog of war. Every once in a while they caveated the things that they were telling us, but they were selling a story. It was an attack, it was spontaneous, it grew out of this protest in front of the embassy or the consulate in Benghazi, and it was because of the film. We now know that virtually all of those claims have proven to be false, or if you believe Chuck's interpretation, they remain ambiguous. But that was the argument the administration was selling. It's not the accurate argument. We now know so much more, and we know what they knew. We know that they were monitoring this in real time at the State Department, at the White House. We know that the CIA station chief called it a terrorist attack immediately. If you were going to rely on the word of one person to help shape how you're viewing this, wouldn't the CIA station chief in Libya have a voice that counts more than anybody else's?
Right. So, whether this has muddied the waters or not over the weekend, one thing is clear. The cables that went up from Ambassador Stevens himself about the rise of Islamic extremism, his concern about security in Benghazi, even on the day that he died, hours before he died, were clear, and we reported them on Friday. I want to get to one other topic, and that is Iran. Charles, over the weekend, take a listen to this back and forth about this New York Times story that said that the U.S. was sitting down one-on-one with Iran.
I think it's a clear indication the sanctions regime that President Obama has put together with Israel and many nations around the world is putting pressure on Iran to sit down and finally acknowledge that they cannot have a nuclear weapon.
Both the White House and the Iranians have said it's not true. It sounds to me, actually, from what Helene just said, that it's Another example of a national security leak from the White House. Governor Romney lay out a clear vision for how to get Iran to do the right thing, which is to stop its progress toward a nuclear weapon. We're 4 years closer to it. What the president has tried has not worked.
So, Charles, the White House has backed away from this story. It was A1 in the New York Times. It made a lot of Sunday talk shows fodder ahead of this foreign policy debate. What's your take on it?
Well, look, what you heard from Senator Durbin is ridiculous. He's assuming this is true, which the White House has now denied, calculated leak. He says, oh, the pressure is working because it's making Iran sit down. Iran has been sitting for 7 years. Iran was in negotiations for all of those 2 years with the G5. They went nowhere. There was a last round of negotiations in Moscow, in Baghdad, and in Istanbul that went absolutely nowhere, humiliatingly nowhere. Iran offered nothing. Even if it sits down, the only reason it would sit down is to delay and stretch it out so that it has extra time in order to develop the bomb, which is exactly what it has been doing since the day Obama was sworn in. So there is no progress, even if it's true, and I suspect it isn't true, but was leaked simply as a way to make the administration look good on Iran, which this does not.
And I can tell you this, sources with allies around the Middle East, they were caught completely flat-footed by this once it hit. Wondering what exactly was going on. Next up, where are we right now in this presidential race? We'll be back with the panel, look at the polls ahead of this big debate tonight.